As the 1990s come to an end and Bill Clinton is out of office beginning in 2001 and George W. Bush takes over in 2001, the United States is in many ways a country that is really the only one globally that can um, take sort of a superior step, right? And we talked about that in the previous video. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Britain, France, they're all doing well, but they're not necessarily as strong as the United States was at this period. Financially, um, in a global perspective, right? The United States is really the only single country that can get involved in the Bosnia-Herzegovina civil war of the mid 1990s, or we didn't talk about this, but Haiti, and there's in the mid 1990s, and there's a real reason for that. Economically, the United States has the tech boom that is going on in the early 90s, late 90s into the very early 2000s before there's a collapse. So the United States economically is doing very well, technologically is doing very well. So for all of these reasons, it is the United States that um, is taking sort of a leading role in globally. And domestically, at least, the United States is also doing well. Um, there are certainly problems, right? There's the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. There's the 1994 Oklahoma City bombing. So there are small events of terrorism, and they do kill a lot of people, but they're not sort of um, they're more symbols than they are anything else, right? So terrorism on a global stage continues to rise, and we're going to be talking about that, right? And largely that's due in a lot of ways because of, again, the sort of collapse of the Soviet Union, and there's a power vacuum in the Eastern Hemisphere, and you have the rise of terrorism within that territory, right? You have problems with Chechnya and other former Soviet territories. On a global stage, there's again, the United States is the real only superpower. The United States is spending a ton of money on defense. And by 2005, the United States is spending more on defense than the next 25 countries. So I just want to pull up a document here, right? I mean, I have this chart, and this chart is posted for you to look at. More all these documents are, I should say, right? I mean, the United States is spending overall way more on than all these other countries, right? And if you look at the total budget, what you got hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, 600 and something $billion, and this is a chart from 2015. So I'm sure I could update this, and it would be a little bit more accurate, right? But then if you look at the next country below it, Russia is spending only 76 billion, and then and so on and so on. So you can see here that the United States is just spending so much more money than our next competitors, right? And the United States also, China has a huge military, but so does the United States, right? Even though the United States is around about half or at least 2/3 of what China's is. If you look at somebody like our peer countries, right? Britain's standing army is only about 200,000. France is in the 200s. Germany's in the hundreds. Now, okay, that obviously makes sense too, right? Proportionally, the United States is a country of 300 million. Britain's got 60 million people. So I guess, proportionally speaking, that all sort of checks out. Um, Same would be true for Germany. Germany is a country of roughly 30 million people. So again, these are not, we're not talking about disproportionate. We're just, again, putting that into perspective. But the United States is really sort of, as a superpower, really the only country that's there. Now, I should also say that just because the United States has a single country, and I've been pointing out trying to use the word single country, is really the only single country to do this, right? And the reason is there is a growing power block in Europe, right? The European Union as a collective of countries is formed in 1992 with a treaty called the Maastricht Treaty, Maastricht. The Maastricht Treaty puts the European Union together. However, by 2000, the EU as a collective is becoming a very strong power bloc that the United States needs to sort of confront with. And that's largely because the EU by 2000 starts to unify around a single currency, the euro. And it starts out with only a few countries involved in the euro. Obviously, Britain still stays out of it, and others, even though Britain is in the EU at this point. Obviously, that's changed recently. But the United States has to contend with the sort of growing strength of the European Union. And the euro currency, is becoming stronger than the US dollar. So that by the early 2000s, excuse me, it takes about $1.50 to get roughly €1. So the euro is becoming a very strong currency. Till today, where the euro is, at least on par with the United States dollar. So the European Union is becoming a much more stronger entity in the early 2000s. And this is encouraging and continuing global connection that was discussed briefly last week, right? The economies of Europe, the economies of the United States, the economies of the globe are becoming more and more interconnected because people are able to move around and have jobs in different countries. People are able to travel very easily. And companies, and one of the things that I guess you can talk about here is sort of this idea of globalization. The United States, in many ways, I think, is the leading globalized country. But that being said, there's also obviously other countries that are globalized as well, right? I mean, FIFA and soccer are, a multi-billion-dollar industry that goes around the globe. And just because the United States maybe is less of a soccer country doesn't mean that soccer is any less of an important industry around the globe. Or you have places like, companies, like what Zara, the Spanish clothing company, or, car companies, right? These are all globalized industries. But English, though, is certainly the lingua franca, the common language of all of these. So moving down here, I do want to talk a little bit about the economy. So if you look at the documents, right, and then we talk a little bit about the European Union, right? I have a couple of things here about the European Union, and what I'm trying to show you here is that there's this growing desire for interconnectedness, this growing desire for cooperation among countries. That's sort of continuing the items from the mid 20th century that we've discussed. Globalization, one of the things I want to point out here is that globalization is not Americanization. The Americanization, I think is certainly true, but I think there's also a piece of this that, it's important to notice that there are other countries as well that are important here. And then you have some other items here about globalization. All right, so the final thing I want to talk about here is how this globalization and this global connectedness is also part of a growing problem that will ultimately lead to the Great Recession that begins in 2008. So through the 2000s, there is a massive construction boom, very similar to the construction boom that happens in the mid 20th century. However, when in the mid 20th century, banks are still skeptical and banks are giving, requiring a certain amount of loans, a certain amount of money to give loans, that's not necessarily happening in the early 2000s. So that in the early 2000s, where, you used to have 20% down or at least plus 10% down, by early 2000s, one of the things that's happening is that there's a reduction in that value. So that by early 2000s, people are getting some loans as low as 3% down, meaning you're mortgaging 97% of the home's value. And within the banking industry, there's an ability to bundle these mortgages, right? So and then insure them, right? So what you would do if you were a bank is you'd have, let's say, 20 of these mortgages that are subprime, less than 3%, and you would then bundle those together, insure them, so that if they do fail, at least you get your money back as a bank. And the only person out of that money really is the individual, right? Because the banks are insuring it, and then the banks can then sell the asset, the house, or the real estate. And what ultimately happens, though, this is all well and good as long as there's more and more inventory to keep selling, right? But once the inventory stops, right, once everybody who has a house, everybody who wants a house has a house, you no longer need to keep buying, or there's a shrinking of that market, and as a banking industry, your value is tied to the value of that house. So as long as more people want those houses and the value goes up, then you're okay. Once people stop buying houses and the industry shrinks, now what you've got is a overpriced commodity, an overpriced house, and you've marketed your insurance to that. So when the market crashed and people stopped buying houses because everybody who wants a house has a house, you now start having banks closing because banks can't, banks have over leveraged their value. And all as so there's an inventory problem, less people, there's fewer people who want houses. There's an inventory problem. There's also an equity problem, right? Banks are less likely to lend if they're losing money. So overall, this is a sort of a terrible situation that begins in the early 2000s and sort of trickles across the globe. And that's one of the major problems here of the global recession that happens from 2008 and onward, is that the global interconnectedness creates many of the problems that we ultimately see.